Chilling yard sale, horror stories you won't believe. Part 1. The Mysterious Toolbox. Jake Thompson had always found solace in the simplest of things. As an insurance agent, his life was often consumed by the grind of numbers, policies, and the endless string of phone calls that seemed to never end. It was a job that required precision, focus, and a steady hand, traits that Jake had mastered over the years. But there was one thing that his job lacked: a sense of peace. The kind of peace that could only be found when he was away from the desk, away from the calls, away from the constant pressure. And that peace, he discovered, came from something unexpectedly ordinary: yard sales. On most weekends, Jake would spend his Saturday mornings wandering the suburban streets, searching for signs of the latest neighborhood sale. He wasn't in the market for anything specific, just the thrill of the hunt. The idea of finding something with history, something with a past, intrigued him. The dusty books, the mismatched dishes, the old furniture. Each item seemed to have a story to tell. For Jake, it wasn't just about the things. It was about the memories they carried, the lives they had touched before him. It was during one of these weekend excursions that he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. A small, handwritten sign caught his attention as he drove through a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. "Yard sale, everything must go," the sign proclaimed in bold, scrawled letters. Jake had been driving aimlessly, his mind occupied by the work he had left behind for the day. But something about the sign, something about the invitation to explore, made him veer off course. He parked his car and got out, the familiar scent of fresh grass and distant barbecues filling the air. The yard sale wasn't much, just a folding table set up in the driveway, with a scattering of random items, a few books, a set of mismatched kitchen utensils, and a collection of tools. But there, in the far corner of the table, stood an object that caught Jake's eye immediately. A rusty old toolbox, worn and weathered with age. It was nothing remarkable at first glance, but there was something about it that drew him in. Maybe it was the faded red paint, chipped and peeling with time. Maybe it was the way it seemed to stand there, almost forgotten, as if it had once been someone's prized possession. Jake knelt down and ran his fingers over the cold metal surface. For a moment, he was transported back to his childhood, his grandfather's garage, the scent of motor oil and sawdust lingering in the air. His grandfather had owned a similar toolbox, a sturdy, old-fashioned thing that held all kinds of tools: wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers. It was a treasure chest of sorts, a reminder of the days when things were built to last. Jake opened the toolbox, his heart fluttering with a strange excitement. Inside, there were a few rusty wrenches, a couple of old screwdrivers, and an ancient hammer with a wooden handle that had been worn smooth from years of use. Nothing valuable by any means, but the nostalgia was overwhelming. He could almost smell the wood, hear the rhythmic tapping of a hammer on nails. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice teaching him how to use each tool with care, with purpose. It was a small moment, a fleeting memory, but one that felt important. "How much for this?" Jake asked the elderly man running the sale, lifting the toolbox up in his hands. The man looked up at Jake from beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes squinting in the afternoon sun. He had the kind of weathered face that told 1,000 stories, each wrinkle a testament to a life lived. He gave a shrug, almost as if he hadn't expected anyone to show much interest in the rusty old toolbox. $10, the man said, his voice gravelly and calm, as if the price didn't matter much to him. Jake didn't hesitate. $10 was a small price to pay for such a piece of history. He handed over the cash without a second thought. They exchanged a few words about tools, how they just didn't make them like they used to, and then Jake carefully placed the toolbox in his car. He drove home with a sense of satisfaction, pleased with his find, eager to clean it up and maybe use it to organize some of his own tools. It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, Jake set the toolbox in the garage and admired it for a few moments before heading inside. He had almost forgotten about it when the doorbell rang the next week. It was late in the evening, just as he was finishing dinner. Jake wasn't expecting anyone, so he wiped his hands on a towel and made his way to the door. As he opened it, he was greeted by a man he didn't recognize. The man was in his late 40s, with a wiry build and short, disheveled brown hair. His face was sharp, almost gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold something unsettling behind them. He looked out of place on Jake's doorstep, like a shadow in the daylight. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice cautious but polite. The man looked at him for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and gravelly. "You bought a toolbox at a yard sale last week, right?" Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. Yeah, why?" "It's mine," the man said, his words flat and insistent. "It got sold by mistake. I need it back." Jake hesitated. The man's tone was strange, forceful, demanding even. There was something about the request that didn't sit right with him. The elderly man who had sold it to him hadn't mentioned anything about it being someone else's. But then again, maybe there had been some kind of mistake. Still, Jake was sure of one thing. He had paid for it, and it was his now. "I'm sorry, but I bought it fair and square from the man running the sale," Jake explained, trying to be as polite as possible. "If there's been a mistake, you'll have to take it up with him." The man didn't seem to like the answer. He stepped closer to the door, his face tightening. "I need that toolbox back," he insisted, his voice growing more urgent. "It's important. You don't understand." Jake could feel a ripple of unease spreading through him. The man's desperation seemed genuine, but something about the situation felt off. "I'm sorry, but I can't give it back," Jake said, firmer now. "I bought it legally." The man stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrow before he nodded curtly. "Fine, but I'll be back. You'll regret this." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there in the doorway, his heart racing. Jake's instincts told him that something was wrong. It wasn't just the toolbox. It was the way the man had spoken, like he knew more than he was letting on, like the toolbox was far more than just a collection of old tools. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. Jake tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, but the man's words kept echoing in his head. And then, 2 days later, he was back. This time, the man wasn't knocking politely. He was pounding on the door, shouting for Jake to open it. "I know you're in there," the man shouted, his voice frantic. "Just give me the toolbox and I'll leave you alone." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't answer, unsure of what to do. He watched through the peephole, his hands trembling as the man's face twisted in frustration, his fists pounding against the door. It was as though the man was losing control, his desperation turning into something darker. After a few moments, the pounding stopped. Jake waited, holding his breath, unsure of what to expect next. He heard the man muttering under his breath before retreating down the steps. For the moment, the threat had passed, but Jake knew it wasn't over. The man would be back. As the days wore on, the visits continued. The man, who Jake would later learn was named Charlie, showed up at odd hours, knocking on the door, calling out through the windows, demanding the toolbox back. Jake's anxiety grew with each visit, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. What was so important about the toolbox? Why was Charlie willing to go to such lengths to get it back? One evening, as Jake sat in his living room, he noticed a car parked outside his house. It was an old sedan with tinted windows, its engine idling quietly in the street. Jake peered through the window, his heart skipping a beat as he realized the man was sitting inside, watching the house. He couldn't see Charlie's face, but the silhouette in the car was unmistakable. The man was there, watching him. The car remained there for hours. Each time Jake checked, it was still there, parked just across the street, Charlie sitting behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on the house. It felt like a constant presence, an unnerving reminder that he wasn't alone. Jake tried to tell himself it was nothing, just coincidence. But the growing sense of dread wouldn't leave him. He couldn't escape the feeling that Charlie was watching him, waiting for something. And then, the next evening, Jake heard the knock again. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was the sound of Charlie trying to break the door down. As Jake rushed to the door, he realized that what had started as a harmless purchase from a yard sale had now turned into a nightmare. Part 2. The Breaking and Entering. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. After years in the insurance business, he had learned to manage stress, making rational decisions even in the most chaotic situations. But nothing could have prepared him for the unsettling events that began unfolding after he purchased that seemingly innocent toolbox at the yard sale. What had started as a simple Saturday morning outing, a quest for something nostalgic, quickly spiraled into a nightmare that Jake couldn't wake up from. It began with the visit from Charlie, the man who claimed the toolbox was his. Jake tried to brush off the encounter as a simple misunderstanding, believing the man's insistence on wanting it back was nothing more than a quirky mistake. But the more Charlie returned, each time growing more frantic and aggressive, the less Jake was able to ignore the uneasy feeling settling deep in his stomach. The toolbox, just a relic from the past, something that reminded him of his childhood, had somehow become the center of a much darker story. Days turned into nights, and with each passing moment, the tension surrounding the toolbox seemed to thicken. The persistent knocks, the threatening words, the strange man waiting outside in his car for hours. Jake could no longer pretend that he was dealing with someone simply looking for a lost possession. This was something more, something dangerous. One evening, Jake returned home after a long day at work, his mind preoccupied with the mundane tasks of life. The familiar scent of his old leather couch and the faint hum of the refrigerator greeted him as he stepped inside. He had learned to push his worries aside, telling himself that he was just overreacting to an uncomfortable situation. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence of his thoughts. It was late, a little past 9, and Jake wasn't expecting anyone. He frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for the keys on the hook by the door. Maybe it was just a neighbor or one of those door-to-door salespeople. When he opened the door, the chill in the air outside seemed to seep in, as if the night itself was holding its breath. There, standing in front of him, was Charlie. This time, however, Jake could see the desperation in the man's eyes more clearly than ever before. The bags under his eyes were darker, his face gaunt and drawn. Charlie was no longer just a stranger. He was someone who had crossed into a dangerous territory, someone who was now too far gone to back down. "I need the toolbox." Charlie's voice was raspy, as if it had been worn thin by endless shouting. "You have no idea what you're involved in. Just give it back to me. It's not too late to fix this." Jake's pulse quickened. He had never seen Charlie this close, and the man's words seemed to echo with an intensity that rattled his resolve. This wasn't just about a toolbox anymore. There was something bigger at play, something that Jake had inadvertently stepped into without realizing the full extent of it. "I told you, I bought it fair and square," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the rising fear he felt. "It's mine now. I'm not giving it back." Charlie's eyes flickered with an emotion Jake couldn't quite place. There was a moment of silence, a heavy pause, before Charlie took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Jake instinctively stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. "You don't understand," Charlie said, his voice low and dangerous now. "It's not about the toolbox. It's about what's inside it. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before Jake could respond, Charlie turned on his heel and walked away, his steps echoing ominously down the driveway. Jake stood there, frozen for a moment, processing the encounter. The warning in Charlie's eyes sent a shiver up his spine. What was inside the toolbox that was so important? What was it that Charlie wasn't telling him? Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. That night, the feeling of being watched returned, sharper than ever before. Jake tried to shake it off, thinking it was just his nerves getting the better of him. He locked all the doors and windows, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to focus on something mundane to take his mind off the incident. But the unease gnawed at him, lingering like a heavy cloud over his thoughts. As he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, he thought he heard something. Just a slight rustle from the direction of the front door. It could have been the wind, or maybe it was just his imagination. But then he heard it again. A faint, hollow thud against the door. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was Charlie, or if it was just a random noise. But something told him it was far from random. His heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, an unmistakable knocking, rapid and insistent. Jake's mind spun, his hand reaching for his phone. His fingers were shaking as he dialed 911. He wasn't sure what he was dealing with, but he knew it wasn't just some harmless yard sale misunderstanding anymore. It was something far worse. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, but Jake's own panic seemed to fill the room. "There's someone at my door," Jake said, his voice trembling. "He's been coming around for days, and now he's trying to break in." "Stay on the line," the operator instructed, her tone steady. "Help is on the way. Is the door secure?" Jake glanced nervously at the front door. It was still locked, but the rattling sound of the doorknob twisting and turning made his blood run cold. Whoever was outside wasn't just knocking. They were trying to force their way in. Jake's breath hitched as the door rattled more violently. He stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the door handle, the sound growing louder, sharper with each passing second. Then, with a violent bang, the door frame shuddered as if something, or someone, had slammed into it with all their weight. He could hear Charlie's voice now, muffled but clear through the door. "I know you're in there. Open the door. Give me the toolbox." There was a wild desperation in his words, a frantic, unhinged tone that sent a jolt of fear straight to Jake's core. This wasn't just about a toolbox anymore. This man was unhinged, and Jake was trapped inside with him. Jake's hand trembled as he backed away from the door. He couldn't just stand there. He needed to do something, anything. As the sound of the door shaking intensified, Jake grabbed the nearest object, an old baseball bat he kept by the door for emergencies, and held it tightly in his hands. The weight of it felt reassuring, but not nearly enough to calm his racing heart. The door shook again, this time harder, and Jake heard the unmistakable sound of splintering wood as the lock gave way. The door flew open, and Charlie rushed in, his eyes wild with fury. Jake barely had time to react as Charlie lunged at him, knocking the bat out of his hands and shoving him back. Jake stumbled, crashing into the wall, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he tried to regain his balance. Charlie stood over him, panting heavily, his face twisted with rage. "I told you I needed it back!" Charlie shouted, his hands shaking as he reached for Jake's collar, dragging him to his feet. "You don't know what you've done! You have no idea what's inside that toolbox!" Jake's mind raced, his senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through him. He struggled against Charlie's grip, but the man's strength was unnerving. His hands were like iron, relentless in their hold. But just as Jake was about to fight back, a loud bang echoed from the street outside. followed by the unmistakable sound of sirens. The police were here. Charlie froze for a moment, his eyes darting nervously to the door. He seemed to realize, too late, that his time was running out. With a final frustrated grunt, he shoved Jake aside and bolted for the back door, disappearing into the night. Jake fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his heart still racing. He had survived. But as the police arrived and began taking his statement, Jake realized that the nightmare wasn't over. Charlie may have run, but Jake knew he wouldn't be safe until the full truth about the toolbox was uncovered. The door had been forced open. His home had been violated. And the only thing Jake could think about as the police questioned him was one simple truth. Charlie wasn't done. And the toolbox, it was still out there, waiting. Part 3. The Terror Escalates. The morning after the break-in, Jake sat in the middle of his living room, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered sense of safety. The police had already come and gone, taking photographs of the door that had been kicked in, dusting for fingerprints, and asking their usual round of questions. But Jake knew deep down they couldn't give him the one thing he truly needed: peace of mind. Charlie had vanished into the night before the officers arrived, leaving behind no trace but the damage he had done. Jake felt the sting of humiliation and disbelief that someone had violated his home so violently. But it wasn't just about the broken door or the bruises on his arms from the brief struggle. It was the realization that his life was no longer his own. He was being watched, hunted, dragged into something far beyond a simple misunderstanding over a yard sale item. In the hours that followed, Jake replayed everything in his head. Charlie's words haunted him. You don't know what you're dealing with. What had he stumbled into? He had handed over the drugs found in the toolbox to the police, and yet Charlie still came for him. That meant the drugs weren't the whole story. There was something else, something more important, something still hidden. Jake began digging, both figuratively and literally. He took the remaining contents of the toolbox, which had been returned to him by the police after they took evidence photos, and went through every screw, every bolt, every compartment again. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers along the inside, tapping gently against the metal to listen for inconsistencies. He remembered reading once that some smugglers used double walls, fake linings, or magnetic compartments to hide high-value contraband. If Charlie had gone to such lengths to recover the box, it wasn't just because of the white powder. Jake had to be sure. He found it 2 hours later. A tiny panel along the side, hidden beneath a rusted hinge, gave way to a narrow cavity that had been expertly welded shut. Using a flathead screwdriver and a chisel, Jake pried it open, bit by bit. The metal screeched in protest, but finally gave way to reveal a thin, black envelope, sealed in plastic. Inside was a small stack of Polaroid photographs. At first glance, they didn't seem like much. Grainy, dimly lit shots of faces and locations Jake didn't recognize. But as he studied them closer, a sickening feeling sank in. These weren't just personal snapshots. They were surveillance photos. One was of a woman holding a baby outside a daycare center. Another showed a man exchanging an envelope with someone in a car. Several were zoomed in on cash, bags, and hands passing off items in parking lots. Drug deals, transactions, evidence. Jake felt like he was holding the heart of a criminal operation in his hands. Photographic proof of something bigger than Charlie. Something organized, coordinated, dangerous. That night, sleep didn't come. Jake kept the photos in a lockbox and called the detective assigned to his case first thing the next morning. Detective Merrill, a woman with a stern face and a voice that didn't waver, listened quietly as Jake explained what he'd found. She asked him to bring the photos in immediately. "Jake, this might be connected to a case we've been building for months," she said. "These people aren't small time. If Charlie is involved with them and he thinks you've got leverage, you're not safe. We need to act fast." The words hit him like a wave. Not safe, not even now. Later that evening, as dusk rolled across the neighborhood, Jake noticed something strange. A white van he didn't recognize was parked across the street, partially hidden behind a row of trees. It hadn't been there earlier in the day, and the way it sat, engine running, made every nerve in his body go on alert. He turned off the lights in his house and moved quietly from room to room, watching from behind the curtains. He spotted two silhouettes inside the van. They weren't just parked. They were waiting. Jake's instincts screamed at him to call the police again, but he hesitated. What if these people were smarter than Charlie? What if they had insiders? What if calling attention to himself only made things worse? He needed to outsmart them. Taking a deep breath, Jake went into his garage and pulled out an old security camera system he had bought months ago but never installed. He spent the next 3 hours setting up every angle he could: driveway, front door, side yard, and the hallway leading to the back entrance. Then he did something even bolder. He left the house. Jake drove to a friend's cabin 2 towns over, a place he knew was remote, quiet, and untraceable. Before leaving, he left a pair of boots by the door, a jacket draped over a kitchen chair, and a light on in the living room to give the illusion he was still home. The cameras would catch whatever happened next. And they did. 2 nights later, while sitting in a cabin with the forest silence pressing in around him, Jake got a motion alert on his phone. He opened the app linked to his home cameras and his blood ran cold. 2 men, dressed in black, faces obscured by ski masks, crept up to his back door. They moved methodically, scanning the property, disabling the outside lights, and checking the windows. One of them carried a crowbar. The other held what looked like a bolt cutter. They were prepared, trained. This wasn't a break-in out of desperation. This was an operation. Jake watched helpless as the men entered his home. The feed from the hallway camera showed them moving swiftly, heading straight toward the garage, toward the toolbox. But it was gone. Jake had taken the lockbox with the photos to the detective the day before. There was nothing left to find. The men searched anyway. They tore through his bedroom, his closet, the kitchen drawers. One of them stopped in the living room, staring directly at the camera, then raised his hand and smashed it with a hammer. The screen went black. Jake sat frozen, the quiet hum of the cabin suddenly unbearable. They weren't just looking for the photos. They were trying to erase any connection, any evidence that could trace back to them, and now they knew Jake had what they were after. Detective Merrill arranged for Jake to stay in protective housing for a few nights after reviewing the footage. The break-in confirmed everything. This wasn't just a dispute over a box. Jake had become entangled in a criminal web that stretched far beyond Charlie. She warned him to be careful, to stay alert, and most of all, to assume that whoever was behind this would come back. Jake's world had shrunk. His routines disappeared. He no longer felt safe in public, avoided the grocery store, didn't return phone calls from friends. The normalcy he once clung to was gone, replaced by a sense of constant dread. The people in those photos had seen his face now. If Charlie had told them who he was, where he lived, or worse, what he had given the police, Jake wasn't just in danger. He was a target. But through the fear, through the uncertainty and isolation, a fire began to grow inside him. If he was being hunted for telling the truth, then he had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Whatever Charlie had been involved in, whatever those photos revealed, Jake knew one thing for sure. He had become part of the story now, and the only way out was through it. Part 4. The Aftermath and Unanswered Questions. The weeks that followed Jake's forced move to protective housing felt like a blur. It was like he had been living in a dream, one where every noise, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a streetlight felt charged with a sense of danger. He had gone from being a simple insurance agent with a passion for collecting old tools and items to someone constantly on edge, living in fear of the shadows that might be lurking around the corner. In the wake of the break-in, Detective Merrill had taken charge of the investigation. She had promised that they would continue to look into the photographs Jake had found and the criminal operation that appeared to be tied to Charlie. But despite her reassurances, Jake could not shake the feeling that he was just a small part of something far larger, something that had already spiraled beyond his control. Every day he thought about the toolbox, the innocuous item that had led to all this. It was meant to be a simple connection to the past, something that would remind him of the time spent in his grandfather's garage. Instead, it had led him into a world of lies, drugs, and surveillance. And now, he was stuck in a life that felt more like a game of survival than anything resembling normalcy. The nights in the small, sterile apartment provided by the authorities were the worst. Alone, Jake would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city below. The silence was always broken by the occasional sound of sirens or the hushed murmur of people in the hallway. But it wasn't the external noise that kept him awake. It was the constant, unshakable feeling that someone, somewhere was watching him, waiting. The fear, the sense of being hunted, had settled into his bones like an unwelcome companion, one that never seemed to leave. But what truly gnawed at him, more than the fear itself, was the unanswered question that had been burning in his mind since the moment he opened the hidden compartment in the toolbox. What was the real purpose of those photographs? Jake had seen drug deals. He had seen faces, people exchanging money for what he now understood was illicit product. But there were no names attached to any of these people, no direct links. And that left Jake wondering whether the whole thing was about more than just drugs. The photographs showed something far deeper, perhaps blackmail, or something more sinister still. Whoever had been involved in this operation had been careful, meticulous. They had made sure no one could trace anything back to them. A part of Jake still believed that Charlie had been acting out of desperation, that he had been a small cog in a much larger machine. But another part of him couldn't shake the thought that Charlie might not be the true mastermind. Maybe Charlie was just a pawn in a larger scheme, one that reached far beyond anything Jake could imagine. Jake had been living in protective housing for nearly 2 weeks when the phone call came. It was from Detective Merrill. He had been expecting it for days, but when the call finally arrived, it felt like a punch to the stomach. "Jake," she said, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet urgency. "We've been following up on the photographs you gave us. You were right. There's more to this than we thought. We found something." Jake felt his heart race. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "We tracked down one of the people in the photos. It's someone named Jonathan Reyes. We believe he's the one coordinating the operations. He's been involved in some major drug trafficking rings, but he's been careful. Too careful. The operation has been running under the radar for years." Jake's pulse quickened as Merrill continued. "But there's something else. A lot of the faces in those photos, they match up with people from your neighborhood. I think these people have been operating right under our noses, hiding in plain sight." The revelation sent a chill down Jake's spine. He had been a part of this world all along, without even knowing it. These criminals hadn't just come into his life by accident. They had been there, in the background, hiding behind the veil of normalcy. His neighbors, the people he interacted with every day, what if they were involved? What if he had been living alongside criminals, never suspecting that danger was so close? But what struck Jake most about the conversation was what Merrill said next. "Jake, there's more. The toolbox you found, the one you bought at the yard sale, wasn't a random purchase. It was planted. Someone wanted you to find it. The words hung in the air between them. What do you mean? It was planted? Jake asked, confusion rippling through him. Whoever placed that toolbox at the yard sale knew you'd buy it. They knew you were the type to take interest in old things, in tools with a history. They had been watching you, Jake. Jake's mind reeled as he tried to process the weight of what Merrill was saying. He wasn't just an accidental player in this game. He was part of a plan. Someone had carefully orchestrated everything that had happened, from the yard sale to the toolbox to the photos, and Jake had unknowingly walked right into their trap. He felt sick to his stomach as the realization set in. The police might have been keeping an eye on him for his safety, but Jake was far from safe. He was entangled in something much bigger, something he still didn't fully understand. The question was, who was behind it all? And why had they chosen him? Later that evening, as he sat in his apartment, Jake began to replay the events in his mind, searching for any clues, any signs that he might have missed. He thought about Charlie, his frantic visits, his insistence on wanting the toolbox back. Had Charlie been involved in this scheme? Or had he been a pawn too? Just another person caught in the web of deception? The silence of the apartment weighed heavily on Jake, and the darkness seemed to close in around him. As he looked out the window, his thoughts turned to the toolbox again, the object that had started it all. Despite the fear that lingered in his mind, Jake knew one thing for sure. The toolbox held the answers, but those answers were buried beneath layers of lies and threats, and no matter how hard he tried, Jake couldn't escape the sense that the real story was still unfolding, just out of reach. Jake hadn't spoken to his friends in weeks. He had avoided everyone, family, colleagues, acquaintances, fearing that anyone close to him might be involved in this web of secrets. He had stopped answering calls, stopped responding to texts, and for the first time in his life, Jake felt completely alone. His sense of isolation grew with each passing day. One evening, as Jake sat by the window, watching the world outside go on without him, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jake?" A familiar voice came through the phone. It was Detective Merrill again. "Jake, I need you to listen closely," she said, her voice urgent. "We've got a break in the case. It's not over yet." His stomach clenched. "What is it? What did you find?" "Jake, I'm sorry, but we've just discovered something shocking. The photographs you found, they weren't just part of a drug ring. They were connected to something even darker. The people in those photos, they weren't just criminals. They were part of a bigger organization, an organization that has been operating for decades, and it's been watching you." Jake's pulse raced. "Watching me?" he repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "We believe you were being followed long before you ever bought that toolbox. They've been tracking you, watching every move you made, and they're not done yet." Jake felt the walls closing in around him. The unanswered questions, the paranoia, the looming fear. It all seemed to converge into a single, terrifying truth. He wasn't just running from Charlie or some anonymous criminal. He was being hunted by an entire organization, one that had meticulously manipulated his every move. And just as he thought he might break, just as the weight of it all threatened to crush him, Merrill's next words hit him like a lightning bolt. "We need you to come with us, Jake. Now. They're coming for you tonight." Jake Thompson had lived a life that many would consider ordinary. He was an insurance agent, a man who spent his days behind a desk, dealing with policies, claims, and the routine of an office job. Outside of work, his life was equally simple, filled with weekend trips to yard sales, a hobby that brought him a sense of calm and nostalgia. Little did he know that this simple, seemingly innocent pastime would lead him into a dark, complex world that would turn his life upside down. It all began with the purchase of a rusty old toolbox at a neighborhood yard sale. At first, it was just a way for Jake to relive memories of his grandfather's workshop, a place where time seemed to slow down and the tools carried stories of hard work and craftsmanship. The toolbox was nothing special, just a worn metal box with a few old tools inside. It was a piece of the past, something Jake could hold on to. However, what seemed like an innocent purchase soon revealed itself to be a dangerous catalyst for a much darker chapter of his life. The first sign that things were amiss came when Charlie, the man who had sold the toolbox, appeared at Jake's door, claiming the item was his. At first, Jake dismissed it as a misunderstanding, something easily resolved with a polite conversation. But Charlie's persistence and his increasingly erratic behavior made Jake realize that there was more to the toolbox than met the eye. When Charlie's visits grew more aggressive, Jake found himself caught in a web of intimidation and fear, something that no one could have prepared him for. As the tension between Jake and Charlie escalated, Jake uncovered a hidden compartment in the toolbox, revealing bags of white powder, drugs. This discovery marked the turning point in Jake's life. What he thought was a harmless relic from the past became the key to a dangerous criminal operation. The toolbox, once a symbol of nostalgia, was now a source of terror. Charlie's obsession with reclaiming the box was no longer just about the physical item. It was about the drugs hidden inside it and the dangerous world that Jake had unknowingly stepped into. With the discovery of the drugs came the realization that Jake was not just a bystander. He had become part of something much larger, an underground world of criminal activity. The police were involved, but the danger did not subside. Charlie's desperation grew, and soon, Jake found himself in a cat-and-mouse game with a dangerous individual who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Even after the police intervention, the sense of danger never fully left Jake's life. The fear that he was being watched, that someone was lurking in the shadows, became a constant presence. The terror only deepened when Jake discovered that Charlie wasn't working alone. He was part of a much larger operation, one that had been running under the radar for years. The photographs Jake found in the hidden compartment of the toolbox were proof of the vast network of criminals involved in this operation. These photos, showing deals, exchanges, and hidden faces, revealed that Jake had been unknowingly living in close proximity to these criminals. He realized that the very community he had trusted, the neighborhood he had called home, had been harboring these dangerous individuals. The most unsettling part of the story came when Jake learned that he had been carefully chosen. The toolbox, with its hidden compartment, had been planted at the yard sale for him to find. This was no random event. He had been watched, tracked, and manipulated from the moment he had picked up that toolbox. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to pull Jake into a world that he had no business being a part of. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a pawn in a larger, far more dangerous game. As the investigation unfolded, Jake's life became increasingly isolated. He moved from one safe house to another, always under the watchful eye of the police. But no matter how many times he changed his location, the fear of being followed, of being watched, never truly left him. The truth about the criminal operation was revealed piece by piece, but Jake never felt the relief he had hoped for. The people who were behind it all remained elusive, their motives unclear, and the fear of what might come next hung over him like a cloud that would never dissipate. In the end, Jake realized that the danger was far from over. Even after the police had uncovered key figures involved in the operation, the mastermind behind it all remained at large. The toolbox, the object that had once symbolized a connection to his past, was now a reminder of how quickly a person's life could spiral out of control. Jake had learned the hard way that even the most innocent of actions, buying a piece of old furniture or a rusty toolbox, could have consequences that reverberated far beyond what he could have imagined. He had been forced to face a reality that many people could only dream of, a life where nothing was safe, where trust could be shattered in an instant, and where the past was never truly gone. But despite the fear and uncertainty, Jake emerged from this nightmare forever changed. The events that unfolded over the course of his ordeal were a harsh reminder that life can change in the blink of an eye, that the choices we make, no matter how small they may seem, can lead us down paths we never intended to travel. The toolbox, once a symbol of nostalgia, had become a symbol of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of fate. Jake's story is a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. It teaches us that sometimes the most innocent seeming decisions can lead to dangerous consequences. It also highlights the importance of awareness, of being aware of the world around us and the people we trust. Jake's descent into the world of crime wasn't a result of anything he did wrong. It was a result of someone taking advantage of his trust, his curiosity, and his innocence. One of the most important lessons we can take from Jake's story is the significance of trust and how quickly it can be broken. Trust is something we often take for granted, assuming that the world around us is benign, that people have good intentions. But the reality is that not everyone can be trusted, and sometimes even the people closest to us can hide dangerous secrets. Jake had been trusting in his neighborhood, in his community, believing that the world around him was safe, but the truth was far darker than he could have ever imagined. Another key takeaway from this story is the importance of remaining vigilant and taking control of our own safety. Jake's journey wasn't just about surviving the dangers that were presented to him. It was about how he navigated the fear and uncertainty that followed. He had to make difficult choices, to take steps to protect himself and his future. And even when it seemed like the threat was over, Jake realized that the danger was far from gone. The lesson here is that we must always be prepared for the unexpected, that life can change in an instant, and that we must take the necessary steps to protect ourselves when things go awry. Lastly, Jake's story teaches us the importance of resilience. Despite everything he went through, the fear, the trauma, the sense of betrayal, Jake never gave up. He fought back, even when he felt powerless. He pushed forward, even when the answers seemed elusive. The story of Jake Thompson is a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive, to adapt, and to keep moving forward even in the face of overwhelming fear and uncertainty. In our own lives, we may not be faced with the same terrifying challenges that Jake encountered, but we are all susceptible to situations where our safety and trust are compromised. We live in a world where danger is often hidden beneath the surface, where things are not always as they seem. The lesson here is to always remain aware of our surroundings, to trust our instincts, and to take action when something doesn't feel right. It's easy to assume that our daily lives are safe, that the people around us are trustworthy, but Jake's story serves as a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. It encourages us to stay vigilant, to question things that don't seem right, and to take steps to protect ourselves and those we care about. Most importantly, it reminds us that resilience is key. Life will throw obstacles at us, but it's how we handle those challenges that defines us. Jake's story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a call to be more aware, to protect our lives and our loved ones, and to never underestimate the power of resilience. We may not be able to predict the twists and turns life will throw our way, but we can control how we respond to them. And just like Jake, we can rise above fear, push through uncertainty, and emerge stronger. If you found this story gripping and insightful, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more spine-chilling, thought-provoking tales. Your support keeps us going and motivated to bring you the best content possible. We've got more thrilling stories lined up, so don't miss out. Stay tuned, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we never see coming.